This year, the United States of America turns 250 years old. 2.5 centuries since a group of ordinary people did something extraordinary. They challenged the most powerful empire on earth and won. But anniversaries are not just for celebration. They're for remembering why things exist in the first place. Because the rights that Americans have today weren't granted out of generosity. They weren't inevitable. They weren't free. They were demanded. They were defended. And they were paid for in blood. Every right written into our Constitution exists because something went wrong before. Power was abused and liberty was threatened. And if we forget why we created these rights in the first place, we risk losing them to the same forces that made them necessary to begin with. To understand America at 250, we need to go back in time, back to the moment when compromise ended, when negotiation failed, when one line, when crossed, made our independence unavoidable. That moment came when a government decided that its people could no longer be trusted with arms. That was the point of no return. But before our revolution, it's important to remember something that's often forgotten. Our colonies didn't start out wanting to be independent. Most colonists considered themselves to be loyal British subjects. They flew the British flag, they toasted the English king, but they asked repeatedly for their rights to be respected as English citizens. In the early 1770s, tensions between the American colonies and Britain were increasingly high over 3 reasons that come to my mind. Firstly, taxation without colonial representation. The American colonies were politically subordinate to Britain. Laws and taxes were made by British Parliament where no colonists could vote or send elected representatives. Parliament argued that the colonies had virtual representation, that members of Parliament represented all British subjects everywhere. And obviously colonists rejected this outright. They believed that only locally elected assemblies could legitimately tax them. Not an empire an ocean away that needs to pay war reparations. The core colonial principle was consent must come from the people being taxed. The second reason that comes to mind is British troops occupying our cities and living in our homes. Imagine a foreign army knocking on your door and telling you to prepare them beds and dinner. This would also lead to the Boston Massacre, but that's not part of this video. The third thing that comes to mind is restrictions on trade and mercantilism, and the harsh enforcement used by the British, transforming them from a distant ruler into a daily, intrusive, annoying presence. What had once been tolerated law slowly transformed into intolerable oppression. All 3 of these reasons that came to mind could be videos on their own. If you'd be interested in deep diving into the reasons for the revolution, I'd be happy to compile data and make those videos for you. Comment down below. But none of these 3 reasons we just discussed automatically led to revolution. Why? Because as long as the colonists believed that they still had leverage, they still had hope. And that leverage came from 2 things: local self-government, which was being taken away, and armed militias. Now you gotta understand that militias weren't radicals. They weren't secret groups. They were legally recognized community-based defense forces. In America at this time, nearly every able-bodied man was expected to have a firearm, which is very different than the people who lived in Europe under tyrannical rule. They didn't own weapons for rebellion. They were for defense, for hunting, and for militia service. To the 18th century American, being armed wasn't extreme. It was a necessity of life. It was normal. It was civic responsibility. It was part of what it meant to be free. As long as the people were armed, power felt shared. And as long as power felt shared, war was avoidable. And to the 21st century American, those ideas are still the same. Over time, British officials increasingly saw armed colonial militias as a threat to their imperial control. To them, the colonies were becoming ungovernable, not because of our ideology over here in America, but because our colonists were too capable of resisting force. Massachusetts especially was seen as a problem. Militia drills were common. Arms and gunpowder were being stockpiled near Boston, and local leaders openly defied royal authority. So, in April 1775, British General Thomas Gage, governor of Massachusetts, made a choice that changed the fate of the world. He ordered British troops to march on the town of Concord. Their mission? Seize colonial military supplies such as gunpowder, shot, which are the round bullets of the day, cannons, etc. Destroy colonial arms stores, where these would have been. And if possible, arrest patriot leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. This wasn't law enforcement. It wasn't symbolic. It was preemptive disarmament. And at Lexington and Concord, armed citizens confronted the British soldiers. There was tension, shouting, weapons raised, and then a shot. A shot heard around the world. To this day, nobody knows who fired first, but everyone understood the meaning. The British weren't trying to enforce their laws. They were asserting absolute authority, and the colonists responded in the only way that a free people could. You see, militias were legally armed under colonial law, and the British weren't marching to enforce taxes. They were neutralizing the population's ability to resist. Colonists interpreted this as the final proof they needed that Britain just wanted to rule by force. Synopsis: the first shots of the revolution were fired because the British were trying to confiscate our guns. And this leads to my point that guns are part of our core identity as Americans. No, the revolution was not only about guns. We've already discussed it was about self-government, legal rights as English citizens, being abused by standing armies, and slowly losing local control over time. But gun confiscation was the point of no return. I think of it this way. Taxes loaded the musket. British troops in the streets cocked the hammer, and trying to disarm us, pulled the trigger. To modern audiences, it's tempting to ask, why was this the breaking point? The answer lies in how 18th century people understood power. The colonists had studied history. They knew how empires worked. American citizens were more literate than England had ever been. They knew that disarmed citizens were entirely dependent on their rulers, that standing armies could force obedience, and that your rights existed only until your government revoked them. In Europe, common people were not trusted with weapons. Only the state had weapons. Colonists in America rejected that model. They believed something, from European perspective, was viewed as radical. Power should flow upwards from us, the armed citizens, not downward by enforcement from soldiers. So when the British tried to seize our weapons, the message was clear. Your rights only exist at British permission. To the colonists, that's tyranny. Not tyranny in theory, tyranny in practice. So from that moment on, our independence wasn't just an idea. It was a necessity. To the 18th century American, militia equals community defense, armed citizen equals protection from tyranny, standing army equal tool of oppression. We believed if they disarm us now, they rule us forever. And they're right. Look what Stalin did, look what Hitler did. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but history rhymes. And 250 years ago, our founders knew this. And after the war, the founders had some hard questions to ask. How do we prevent this from ever happening again? They debated everything from how powerful the federal government should be, to whether we should ever have a standing army, and how does one balance liberty and security? But one lesson was unanimous. A disarmed people cannot remain free. And that belief was carved directly into our Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment wasn't written as an abstract theory. It was written as a historical warning. To quote Samuel Adams, "The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms." This amendment exists because British disarmament attempts triggered war. Armed citizens made independence possible, and liberty had proven fragile when force was monopolized. Guns weren't written into our law as a hobby. They were written as a guardrail to prevent history from rhyming yet again. And over time, this hardened into American identity. Americans didn't just own arms, we associate them with freedom, responsibility, and resistance to tyranny. And that connection didn't come from radical ideology, it came from our experience. And it just makes me think that America wasn't born because a document was signed. It's when ordinary people refused to give up their means to defend themselves. And our refusal made compromise impossible. It made war inevitable, and it made our independence unavoidable. And whether one agrees with modern politics or not, this truth remains. The United States began the moment disarmament was resisted. That moment still echoes, and it still defines how Americans see ourselves today. It is a bit ironic that this all happened in Massachusetts, and that is not a gun-friendly state today. It's actually really sad. That government has gotten out of control. And with that thought, it's good to be reminded that our story didn't end there in 1775. What happened at Lexington and Concord wasn't a historical accident. It created a permanent American suspicion of concentrated power. The founders didn't believe or see tyranny happen overnight. They saw it happen piece by piece, just like it's happening today. Authority moved away from the people and into the hands of the government. Decision-making centralized, and force became the tool of the state. That's why we designed a system filled with friction. We have divided branches of government, federalism over central rule, civilian control of the military, and an armed populace to act as the final balance. The United States Constitution wasn't written assuming that everybody would be good. It was written to assume that eventually, some would not be good. And the Second Amendment is written into that system for a reason. Not as a call to violence, not as permission for chaos, but as a reminder of a hard-learned truth. Our rights are safest when power is not absolute. And in America, guns don't just represent hunting or self-defense. They represent our independence from centralized authority. Responsibility in the hands of us citizens, not the state. And the very American belief that freedom requires our participation in government, not permission from government. And I think that's why gun ownership never just solely became a policy issue. It's a historical memory. Americans don't remember a government giving them liberty. They remember a government trying to take control and failing. And that failure created our nation. The founders never wanted violence. They wanted deterrence. An armed citizenry wasn't meant to overthrow the government. It was meant to make oppression too costly to attempt. A government that knows its power has limits behaves differently. A government that knows the people retain ultimate authority moves slower, negotiates more, and governs with restraint. That's not instability, that's balance. Every generation faces the same question in a new form. How much power should be concentrated at the top? And how much should we retain as the people? For Americans, that question is inseparable from being armed. Not because guns are sacred objects, but because they symbolize a line that was crossed. And it's a line that we, as Americans, have decided will never be crossed again. America began when we, the people, refused to give away our right. And that belief didn't disappear with muskets. It evolved, and it never left. Whether one supports strict regulation or broad access, this much is historically undeniable. The American idea of liberty was forged by armed citizens standing between power and abuse. And I guess that's why this debate still goes on, and why it still matters. Not because Americans want conflict, but because we remember where unchecked authority leads. No matter where you sit politically, there's no denying that the right to own private weapons across our nation is what allows us to protect our freedoms. It allows us to make the personal choices we all make every day. We live in a free nation, but that freedom is not guaranteed. And our rights can and probably will be slowly chipped away if we do not practice and appreciate what our founders left us. Here's to 250 as the best nation in the world.